Hi, everybody. Welcome to my home study. This is where I've been holed up for the past week and a half, like many of you. And over this past week or 10 days, as we've watched this coronavirus begin to kind of grip our world, I've been going back and reading what some of the Christians in past generations have said and what they've done in the midst of other past crises. Let me give you just a couple examples. First of all, Martin Luther, who was a reformer in the 16th century. Luther actually lived during the bubonic plague when 1/3 of Europe was basically wiped out. And some of the younger pastors wrote him a letter to ask, should Christians flee during the plague? And Luther actually wrote a 10-page response in real tiny print of how he would address that situation. And it's really a wonderful model of, sanctified common sense, practical pastoral insight, and biblical insight. Fast forward a few generations to the 1800s. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, lived during the time of a cholera outbreak in 1854 in London. And much of that has been preserved through the pulpit and through the writings of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Go to the 21st century. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a child of privilege, he came to the United States to get an advanced degree, and the war was beginning to kind of foment in Europe. And rather than kind of staying in a cushy situation and with obvious prospects for professional success, Bonhoeffer took the courageous step of going back to lead the Confessing Church, which was kind of like the underground church of his day that was resisting the Nazi movement. He wrote a wonderful sermon on fear. But as you read through, all of these spiritual giants, you see certain lessons repeated again and again. And as I thought about it, I was reminded of one of my favorite verses in the Psalms. It says this: trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and be safe. Now that's a pretty helpful commentary on the wisdom of these spiritual giants. It's also a biblical prescription for the COVID-19 crisis. Let me just point out three directives that the psalmist makes. I'm going to do them in reverse order here. First of all, he says, dwell in the land and be safe. In other words, in the midst of a crisis, observe necessary precautions. You can hear echoes of Luther in the background because Luther walked a very thin line between encouraging people like pastors and doctors and parents who had responsibilities to care for people under their charge, to be courageous and to stay and to care for people. At the same time, he also had the practical wisdom to say there are many of you that should be taking other precautions, that you should be, and then he gave several examples of people who actually fled to save their own life. So I can kind of hear Luther saying, if he were in our day, listen to your healthcare professionals. Wash your hands regularly, practice social distancing. If you're over 65 and if you have a underlying health condition, make sure that you quarantine yourself. But he would go on to say, but remember this, do good. Not only practice these necessary precautions, but in the midst of it, don't miss the opportunity that is all around you, because there's nothing like a crisis to give you unprecedented and intensified opportunities to show love and to share the gospel with the people around you. Listen to what Spurgeon said. He said, I remember when I first came to London, how anxiously people listened to the gospel, for the cholera was raging terribly. If there was ever a time when the mind is sensitive, it is when death is abroad. You can remember that well-known saying, nothing like death to focus the mind. And so we need to realize that our culture right now is spiritually hungry. They're spiritually sensitized in probably few ways that they will be in their life. So it's a great opportunity for us. And we need to stop and think, what would happen if the church would respond by, practicing, safe practices, but at the same time, just being resourceful and being creative and reaching out to love and share with our neighbors. I got to tell you, I am so excited about some of the things I'm hearing that are going on here at New Community. I just heard of a friend who's a seamstress, very skilled seamstress, and she started sewing surgical masks that are now being distributed among those on the front lines of the healthcare industry. She just, began to think, I can do this at home and I can make a difference. I can show love in the name of Christ. I talked to another friend who told me that she's had the best spiritual conversations that she's had with her brother in years. She said he's been very anxious about this whole situation for his family, and the conversations opened up an opportunity to direct him to, our online service this weekend and some of the other initiatives that we're taking to minister to people during this unusual time. And she said it's become his lifeline. So whatever you can do, just be careful that you don't fall into the trap of kind of just turning inward, which is the natural thing to do during a crisis, because the best thing you can do is to turn outwards, both for your own sake and for the sake of others, and be creative. I mean, all of us can pick up a phone, all of us can write an email and just reach out to people and say, hey, I'm thinking about you. How can I pray for you? So be safe, do good, and thirdly, trust God. What does it mean to trust the Lord? Well, it's not saying that if we trust the Lord, everything will be okay and no one will ever get coronavirus. We all know that Christians are not exempt from those kinds of tragedies, those kinds of difficulties. Christians experience loss and heartache and tragedy just like everybody else. But what it does mean is that you can trust God even in the midst of it. To trust in the Lord means to trust in His presence. You remember the 23rd Psalm that said, even when I walk through dark valleys, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. In other words, it's a reminder of God's presence even in the midst of crisis. You can trust God for His promises. He said, nothing shall separate you from the love of Christ, shall life or death or angels or principalities. He said, nothing can separate you from the love of Christ. That's a wonderful promise to remember in a time like this. And thirdly, you can trust Him in His providence. Remember, in all things, God works together for good to those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. So, remember, Spurgeon said this. He said, not a shaft of night shall hit till the God of light sees fit. You see, God sovereignly filters all of life's events through His funnel. And if some difficulty does befall us, we know that God's got a purpose, even if we might not know it, and we can trust the Lord in that purpose. So here's the psalmist's prescription for the COVID-19 crisis. Trust the Lord, trust His presence, trust His promises, trust His providence. Do good, realize that this is an unprecedented opportunity to do good and to show the love of Christ and to share your faith with others. And dwell in the land and be safe. Take the necessary precautions. I hope that'll encourage you today.